The great thing about Chinese is that nobody says it's an easy language to learn. And the bad thing about Chinese is absolutely everything else. The illustrations in this video largely speak for themselves. So I'm going to try not to do too much talking. Some of them are probably worth pausing and staring at for a bit longer if you're trying to get familiar with the etymologies and think about whether or not memorizing the Kangxi system of radicals is the right approach to the language for you. On the left-hand side of the screen, there's a seemingly eccentric radical. This is called the Yon Radical. What a great concept. Other languages just have boring alphabets, but in Chinese, one of the components of the language is just to represent yawning. The most commonly used meaning is actually to owe something, as I've noted there on the screen. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you have right away two examples of how it looks when it's used as a component in forming other characters. Now, here you have 6 Chinese characters on screen. The top row, I'm simply using a font there that shows you what the seal script looked like. And then the row below that is modern handwriting, but those are the same characters, 3 examples, the same 3 you were just looking at before. So here's the Yon Radical. And what should leap out at you from the pictograph on the bottom is that this used to have the standard pair of legs on the bottom of the character that you will have seen again and again in Chinese. Certainly within the first 10 characters you learn, you will have learned the pair of legs radical. And what's on the top of the pair of legs? Appropriately enough for the meaning yawn, it's a very stylized open mouth. So it's supposed to be an image of a man standing with his mouth open. But in a totally incoherent twist of fate, the legs have actually gotten garbled so that we're now depicting the entire human body as the stylized figure for the full human form below the open mouth. And as you've probably noticed, the open mouth is unrecognizable. Here we have a contrast between the Yon radical and 2 other radicals, 2 other characters at least, that feature an open mouth on top of legs. So the same idea was created and recreated in the language in a way that's not systematic. There's no way you could identify one by looking at the other. Of course, there's no way you can ever guess the phonetics from one to the other. And if you haven't already memorized this kind of etymological analysis of the radicals, you wouldn't be able to make the link from the character that's on the left hand of the screen to the character that's on the right hand of the screen. Let alone the one that's halfway in the middle. But actually, all of these are different ways to depict an open mouth on legs, which is, of course, alluding to a human form and a certain type of action. So, even when we know what all the symbols are, they are not systematic. You've probably had enough time to stare at it already, but on screen there, on the left-hand side, one of the most common characters in the Chinese language. You say it every time you say hello, and inexplicably, we've ended up with the open mouth figure from the top half of the Yon radical. It has no business being there. You can look at the pictograph on the far left of the screen, and you can see that this is simply an etymology that's broken, and we're stuck with yet another example of one of the most frequently used words in the Chinese language having no explanation, no meaning, having just broken down and become incoherent. One of the ideas that appears again and again in Chinese is of the human mouth. Many different meanings are expressed by combining a mouth with a few extra lines here or there. On the far left side of the screen, you see what are probably the first 2 examples of this you learn. One is just called the mouth radical, and the other is called the speech radical in English. And then in the center box, we have 3 more elaborate figures where I would say that you probably wouldn't recognize the figure of the mouth, even if you know to look for a certain type of square form. And within these few examples, you already have the idea that anything that's a square or a triangle can be a mouth. And the Chinese language is in large part composed of squares and triangles. So again, the ability of a reader to recognize a mouth as a mouth is almost nil, and the ability to make a sort of correct inference going from one character to another through comparison and so on is close to zero, although not quite zero. Um, and then on the right hand side, this is one of the less widely understood mouth radicals. At the top of the flute radical there, the triangle is another way of depicting the human mouth. The flute radical there, very simply, you're looking at a mouth on top, blowing down into a very stylized depiction of what we call in English as panpipes. The three boxes represent the openings of the holes, and then you have the length of the flute below that. So you can imagine what a different world we would live in if Chinese teachers spent a lot of time explaining to you what any of these images were supposed to be. I think for the most part, people are stuck with memorize and move on attitudes from their teachers and being forced to move through this stuff as quickly as possible. And that's why so many misconceptions about the language are prevalent among both foreigners and native speakers. The flute radical is there again at the top left, and you can see an image of what it looked like in ancient seal script. These images are all thanks to the work of Richard Sears. He actually does not own the copyright to them, but he is the guy who did the hard work of getting them into a format where they could be widely used on the internet, and now they're used by Wikipedia and many other sources. One of the absolutely most common words in the Chinese language is in the top right corner of your screen now. And this is used to form meanings like to be able to do something. All kinds of stories and excuses are made up for this character. It's one of the first characters you have to learn, and I think most people are told just memorize it, it doesn't have to make sense. The part that doesn't make sense, if you look at the seal script, it made sense a few thousand years ago, but we actually do not know what the component in the middle is. So we know we have a mouth at the top, and then we have a different mouth radical at the bottom, but what is in between the two is today unknown. And unless someone is going to go out and really unearth some new archaeological finds, do some analysis of ancient bronze castings or something of the sort, we may never know. So there is one mystery in the middle of that character. In the bottom left corner, this is what you see on signs for restaurants all the time. Again, one of the very first words you'll ever learn. But probably you've had people tell you that the top part of the character is the roof over a house or the roof over a restaurant, or maybe the lid on top of a pot that's boiling food. It's none of those things. It's the mouth radical. And again, if you just compare those three images, three pictographs, you can see very clearly the same triangular idea of stylizing the mouth that's at the top blowing into the pipes and the flute radical. It appears here again above the pot that's cooking the food. And in the bottom right corner, we have a contrast. All of the first three, it would be impossible to guess that you're looking at a mouth with that triangular arrangement at the top. But here, it would be hard to guess that you're looking at the opposite. Historically, this is a pretty famous character because it did actually used to look like a bell, a heavy iron cast bell, common in traditional Chinese culture, still pretty commonly displayed today as a symbol of status or affluence. But it has been stylized incoherently over time to really resemble one of the characters that's built out of the triangular mouth radical. So the moral of the story is that the system is not systematic. And here I'm drawing your attention to the fact that both in the older seal script and in a modern handwritten form, there's really no clear hint. If anything, in this case, it's more confusing in seal script. So it's also not a simple case of saying, well, the new methods of writing are bad and the old methods of writing are good. And many of the resemblances that we rely on are imaginary, not just in the sense that they reflect maybe a tradition of imagining what the characters are supposed to be, but people make up their own stories. People make up their own fables to help them memorize characters, as do teachers, parents, and so on. It would be impossible if you were learning Chinese in a vacuum, if you were just starting from a blank sheet of paper. It would be impossible to guess what these three pictures have in common. And of course, the three characters also have no phonetic link. But believe it or not, all three of the images you're looking at do depict human feet. And there you have the only slightly less stylized image of the feet. Two of them in the radical at the top, one in the bottom left and bottom right. But these different ways of symbolically depicting feet in the seal script stage. So again, the type of inference and connection we make, I don't know if it would be an insult to philosophy to say that it's philosophical, but it takes a lot of imagination, a lot of memorization, and a lot of hard work to wring the meaning out of the system of radicals and to enrich your own reading of Chinese by being able to break down the characters. So in terms of practical conclusions, the radicals are not a systematic description of the language. They're not a system at all. There's no systematic relationship here that's being revealed within the language. Instead, the radicals present an analysis of the language that raises more questions than it answers, and that's okay. And whether or not you think it's okay will come down to your own character, whether or not you think those questions are worth asking, and whether or not you'd like to have access to this kind of ancient and philosophical dimension of the language instead of just memorizing a million meaningless brushstrokes. This is sort of first things last. The etymology of a word may be completely unrelated to its current appearance, and it may now even be unrelated to the radicals that are used in forming that appearance. The example in the bottom left is one of the first words you need to learn in Chinese. You've been saying it every time you say thank you, even if you haven't learned how to write it yet. The next character to the right is the phonetic loan particle used in writing the word for thank you, and it means to shoot, as in to fire an arrow. And then moving a stage further to the right, you see the ancient pictograph when that character actually looked like a hand, a human hand, reaching out for or using a bow and arrow. Tragically and incoherently, it is no longer a depiction of a bow and arrow. Instead, we have a totally unrelated word that actually depicts the human body in a very stylized form that has replaced the bow and arrow. So, coming back to my earlier point, in this case, we're not looking at anything unknown. It's known. The whole history, the whole meaning of the character and all of its components is known and is well understood by scholars. There are no question marks here. It's also broken. So we're left in the 21st century to work within the limits of what I would not even call a broken system, but a bunch of broken information that has not yet even been assembled into a systematic analysis of the language. Lots of fun, huh?